The hospital waiting room in Chicago was bright the way winter at 2 in the morning is bright, merciless and humming. The fluorescent lights buzzed like tired bees, flattening color and warmth from everything they touched. They lit up the cracked vinyl chairs, the vending machine with its blinking "exact change only" sign, and the pale, almost translucent face of Nora Bennett. Her fingers shook against the ragged edges of a single sheet of paper, a bill. $47,000 was stamped across the top like a sentence. It might as well have been a foreign country she'd never traveled to, an amount so large that it turned the air thick, like she was trying to breathe through syrup. Somewhere behind the glass partition, the night shift nurse spoke in hushed tones, and a tired janitor pushed a mop, the lemon cleaner smell mixing with antiseptic until everything tasted like metal. Beyond the glass, her mother, Mara, was a silhouette pieced together by machines and tubes and the relentless green heartbeat line that felt like a timer. Each beep jabbed Nora with a reminder. The clock wasn't just ticking, it was being devoured. The doctor had delivered the news without cruelty but without cushioning either, the kind of honest that bruised. Without the experimental chemotherapy, 6 months was the kind of optimistic estimate polite people offered in hallways. With it, maybe a chance, if they could find $200,000, in a world where Nora couldn't find 200. He had said the number gently, and she had nodded as if she could carry it in both hands. The last 8 months had been less a fall and more a trapdoor. The boutique design firm where Nora had spent her 20s, where she'd fought for soft, natural light and rooms that made people exhale, had shuttered overnight. One Friday afternoon there was a staff meeting with coffee and pastries. By Monday, the lock had been changed and emails had bounced. 2 weeks later, the word leukemia arrived in their lives like a stone through glass. The savings went first, then the jewelry box, then the vintage drafting table she'd rebuilt with her dad before he died. She sent 127 job applications into a void that felt personal, as if it had been built to echo her name back at her and nothing else. Now, dinner was instant noodles that never really softened, and the bitter aftertaste of dread. Her waiting room coffee was lukewarm when her phone vibrated with an unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail. Almost, but something in the silence of the corridor made her answer. "Miss Bennett," a woman's voice said, smooth as a scalpel and just as warm. "My name is Marissa Cole, executive assistant to Mr. Julian Blackwell." The name tumbled somewhere in the vicinity of finance headlines and magazine covers Nora never bought. Blackwell, as in the gleaming Blackwell Tower slicing the cold Chicago sky. As in the man business blogs called the ice algorithm, because nothing seemed to touch him. What is this about? Nora's own voice surprised her, how steady it sounded while the rest of her shook. "Mr. Blackwell prefers to discuss matters in person," Marissa replied, all considerate efficiency. "He would like to meet with you today at 2. A car will be sent to your address. It will be a proposal that could resolve your current financial difficulties." Nora's heart thudded once. A drumbeat of dread and something dangerous. How did this stranger know? What part of her life had become a line item in someone else's binder? Before she could form a follow-up, the call ended and the waiting room settled back into its relentless hum. At 1:55 that afternoon, a black limousine slid up to the curb outside Nora's aging walk-up in Uptown. The vehicle so polished it reflected the gray winter clouds like a lake. It looked wrong in front of her brick building, with the unreliable radiator and the mailbox that hadn't closed properly since 1997. She wore her one good blouse, the one from the interview that never called back, and slacks that now hung loose on her frame. The driver's gloved hand opened the rear door with a soft whoosh, and a nod that was almost kind. Inside, the car smelled like leather and something green and expensive. The city moved past them in a blur of steam vents and bundled pedestrians, and it felt, for a minute, like she'd stepped into a different world that was moving faster than she knew how to stand up in. The limo cut through the loop, past mirrored towers and street musicians braving the cold, the steel spire of the Willis Tower pricking the low clouds. When they pulled up to Blackwell Tower, a spear of glass that looked like it had grown out of Lake Michigan, and decided to keep going. Nora felt her stomach flip. The polished doors parted in front of them like theater curtains. The lobby was a hush of marble and dark wood, the air perfumed with the faint, clean scent of something like cedar and rain. Marissa Cole met her with precision. Navy suit, immaculate bun, a face that did not believe in nerves. She guided Nora through hallways so quiet she could hear her own footsteps, past large-scale photographs of steel and water, to doors so heavy and dark they seemed sculpted, not built. "Mr. Blackwell will see you now," Marissa said, and the doors swung open as if on their own. The office was a throne room for modern gods, a glass wall opening onto a winter-gray lake, a skyline that looked close enough to touch, and a desk so sleek it might have been carved from a single idea. Standing before the world like a man who had never doubted his place in it was Julian Blackwell. Light cut along his profile. He turned. His eyes were the color of whiskey in a dim bar. Not quite amber, not brown, but something that changed depending on the angle. He didn't smile. He didn't extend a hand. He simply inclined his head the slightest bit, and somehow it meant everything. And then, in a voice that felt like a weight and a promise, he said, "Miss Bennett." "Sit," he said. "We have much to discuss." His voice was controlled, softened by nothing, and yet there was a current beneath it that made every part of Nora's body go alert. She sat because what else does a person do when a king points to a chair? He took his place on the other side of a desk that might as well be a small country. That polished surface became a map of what separated them. He watched her as if trying to solve a problem that was a hair more interesting than usual. She wanted to look anywhere else, to make herself small enough to escape that gaze, but life had made her tough in ways that didn't always show. She lifted her chin. If she was going to drown, it wouldn't be because she forgot how to swim. "I've done my research," he said, opening a slim file. The words were cold, clipped. Nora Bennett, 25, School of the Art Institute of Chicago, honors, 8 months unemployed, mother diagnosed with aggressive leukemia, accumulated debts of $89,000, city and medical, and climbing. Each fact landed like a clean surgical cut. Humiliation burned up her neck into her cheeks. It felt like stripping in front of a mirror she hadn't chosen. "If your goal is to humiliate me, Mr. Blackwell," she said quietly, "don't worry. I'm well aware of my situation." For a fraction of a second, something broke surface in his eyes, a quick, surprising flick of what might have been respect, before it vanished. "I'm not humiliating you," he said. "I'm establishing that I know exactly what you need, and what I can give you." "In exchange for what?" The words came out tougher than she felt. He leaned back, fingers steepled, gaze never moving from hers. "I want you to carry my child." The city fell away. The breath stuck behind her ribs. She heard herself say, "I'm sorry? What?" As if from across a too bright room. "I require an heir," he continued, as if discussing a merger. "I have no interest in the emotional entanglements of marriage. I want a clean agreement that benefits us both." He laid out the terms like a surgeon describing a complicated procedure. He would settle all of her debts. He would pay for Mara's treatment, standard, experimental, hospitalization, for as long as it took. He would provide a furnished apartment on Lakeshore Drive and a stipend. Upon the birth of a healthy child, there would be $500,000 wired to Nora's account and a permanent design role within Blackwell Capital's real estate division. A different life offered in bullet points, glossed and precise. "You're insane," Nora whispered, standing without meaning to because she needed to move or she would fold in on herself like paper. He stood too, though the desk remained between them, a deliberate barrier. "I am the sanest man you will ever meet." His voice was even, almost empty. "Think like a strategist, Nora. You are drowning, your mother is dying. I am offering you a lifeboat." He slid a leather-bound folder across the desk. It landed with a soft, final sound that rippled through her. "The full contract. You have 48 hours. And if I say no?" she asked, though the answer was already burning. "Then you leave through that door, return to the life collapsing around you, and watch your mother die knowing You didn't do everything in your power to save her." It was the truth. It was a knife. The worst part was how cleanly it cut. Her hand shook as she picked up the folder. It was heavier than it looked, the way a decision is heavy. "I need to think," she managed. He moved then, leaving the fortress of the desk, and the heat of him, real, human, reached her before he did. The subtle scent of cedar and mint and something she couldn't name, an ocean wind, a memory of rain, curled around her. "Don't let pride stop you from saving the person you love most," he said. He wasn't close enough to touch. Somehow it still felt like contact. She left on legs that didn't belong to her, the contract scalding her hands as if ink could burn. How much is a soul worth? How do you price your future? She sat at her kitchen table that night, the one with the scratch from when Mara set down a hot pan without a trivet, and read until the words blurred. It was made to be clear and inarguable, and so cold it made her stomach cramp. The carrier agrees to relinquish all parental rights upon birth. The benefactor will have sole and absolute custody. The phrase, "healthy child," was defined like a product spec. Nowhere was there room for the mess of ordinary human love. It was an instrument. She was a vessel. At the hospital, Mara was smaller than the bed. Her skin seemed thinner than the IV tape. Nurse Patel, soft brown eyes, calm hands, took Nora into the hall, her words careful but not evasive. "Honey, the standard regimen isn't doing what we need it to," she said. "We have to try something more aggressive soon," or she didn't finish. She didn't have to. The clock on the wall ticked, loud as a hammer. Back home, the eviction notice curled at the corners on the counter, a red final notice stamp screaming at her every time she passed. A notice from the electric company announced power would be cut the next day unless a payment labeled "impossible" found itself onto their ledger. There were no miracles, only the white-hot quiet between breaths when panic sat on your chest like a bad dream. The image of a shining black car and an office in the sky kept flashing behind her eyes like a lighthouse signal and a warning. Trevor showed up with the smile of someone who didn't think he was the villain. "I heard about your mom," he said, opening his arms like he expected the old choreography. He tried to slip concern around her like a coat. "If you need help." "How much?" she said, and watched him flinch at her tone. "I could do like 5,000, he offered, as if generosity were a performance and he had a front row seat. He didn't meet her eyes for long. "I need 200,000, Nora said flatly, and watched the color drain from his face. "Nora, be reasonable." "Get out." He sputtered something about calling him when she calmed down, and she shut the door on that old life with a finality that surprised her. The apartment seemed to exhale after he left. She picked up her phone with a steadiness that felt like walking into a storm and called Marissa. "This is Nora Bennett," she said, and swallowed the acid in her throat. I accept." There was a breath of silence, and then Marissa said, "Excellent. Mr. Blackwell will expect you tomorrow at 9 to sign the documents. A car will be sent." After the line went dead, Nora put the phone down as if it might bite. A sob ripped up through her chest, ugly and ungraceful and entirely honest. She crouched on the kitchen floor, her face pressed into her knees, and mourned something that hadn't even happened yet. Across the river, in a penthouse angled toward glittering channels of traffic and a frozen lake, Julian stood in front of a wall of glass, his untouched whiskey collecting fingerprints he didn't notice. Something like doubt, soft and wild and easily swallowed, moved in him. He recognized it immediately and crushed it. This was a transaction. He had never let anything else in. Blackwell Tower's conference room the next morning was polished winter. 3 lawyers sat in gray suits so similar they looked cut from the same cloth, and trained in the same 2 facial expressions. A stone-faced notary arranged stamps like a small arsenal. Marissa was a silver line of competence at Julian's left, and at the head of the table, he presided like a king holding court over a new province. Nora walked in feeling like an offering, aware of her coat, her shoes, the way need clung to her like smoke you couldn't wash out. The stack of paper the notary slid across was a small cliff. Yellow tabs marked where to sign, 47 of them, each one a square flag she would plant in the country of her own surrender. Nora signed line after line until her name didn't look like English. She signed the clause about relinquishing all parental rights. She signed the payment schedule. The crisp scratch of the pen became the only sound she could hear over the thud of blood in her ears. "It is done," the notary said finally, stamping the last page with a heavy thud. "Congratulations, Miss Bennett. You are now officially under contract." It sounded like an alarm. It sounded like a cell door closing. Marissa slid a black credit card and a set of keys across the table, a small pile of new edges. "Your first appointment at the fertility clinic is tomorrow at 10. These are the keys to your new apartment. We've scheduled your mother's treatment to begin the day after tomorrow." Efficient, clinical, effective. Nora nodded because the room tilted if she did anything else. The lawyers filed out like paper that had been stacked properly. Marissa followed the click-silent choreography of people who always know what to do. The air in the room changed when it was just the two of them, thinner and heavier in equal measure. "I need to know one thing," Nora said. Her voice sounded smaller than it felt inside her chest. He looked up, the mask back in place. "Why me?" she asked. "Why not a professional surrogate? Why this?" A crack showed in him, and she saw something, vulnerability or memory, move under his ribs and then tuck itself away. "Because a professional does it for money," he said, his voice lower than before. "You are doing it for love, for your mother, and I want my child carried by someone who knows what that means, even if I don't." The honesty knocked the breath from her like stepping off a curb she hadn't seen. Before she could gather a single word that felt true, he stood. "Your apartment is on Lakeshore Drive, fully furnished. Marissa will assist with anything else you need." "Julian," she said, because the name tasted strange and used, and because there was something else she needed to press against the edge of him. He paused with his back still to her, the lake beyond him a sheet of gray steel. "Have you really never loved anyone?" Silence stretched, thin as ice and just as dangerous. "No," he said finally, too soft to be mistaken for anything but true. "And it's better that way." The apartment could have been in a magazine titled People Who Never Lose. A long horizon of windows framed Lake Michigan like a painting that moved, all slate and silver. The speedboats long gone for the season, and the joggers on the lakefront trail moving dots between trees. Marble caught the light, glass kissed it back. Nora's footsteps echoed the way lonely words do. She set the keys on the kitchen island because she didn't know where else to put them. Late, lying in a bed big enough to accommodate a small army, her phone buzzed. "I hope the apartment is suitable. Rest. Tomorrow we begin. Julian Blackwell." She stared at the words, crisp and cordoned off, and then opened her palm over her belly, flat and quiet beneath the duvet. Somewhere in the near future, there would be a heartbeat inside her, a heartbeat bought and brokered and still miraculous. She wanted to feel nothing. What moved in her anyway scared her. The fertility clinic glowed in creams and light wood and painted reassurance. It smelled like citrus and something sterile, hope, sanitized. A man in his 50s with silver at his temples and eyes that had seen almost everything greeted them. "Dr. Everett Hartman," he said, shaking her hand like she wasn't a collection of charts. "We'll run the full panel today. Mr. Blackwell, room 3. Miss Bennett, room 5. Separate doors, separate rooms, separate bodies doing something together without touching. Science would do what romance would have done had this been another life." Nora caught Julian's shoulders in profile. They were rigid lines of tension he probably thought no one saw. The next 2 hours were a series of invasions delivered with clinical kindness. Questions that poked at places people don't show. Blood drawn until her veins felt hollow. Cold jelly and colder steel on warm skin. Hallways that smiled in that expensive, impersonal way. She sat in a paper gown on a table, wrapped in white paper, while the air conditioner hummed and Dr. Hartman sat with her, his expression warm in a way that softened edges. "I know this is unorthodox," he said. "My job is to make sure you and the baby are healthy. Not to judge." "Everyone is judging," Nora said, and it sounded like confession. "You're doing this to try to save your mother," he replied, and his voice became something like a hand on her shoulder. "There are easier ways to be selfish than this." There is nothing more noble than love that costs you. That was all it took. Tears came clean, a breaking that wasn't falling apart but releasing the weight she'd been wedging under her ribs. In the waiting room, Julian sat looking like he'd just walked out of a boardroom, except for the edges of his mouth, which were softened by exhaustion. Dr. Hartman invited them into his office with good news wrapped in authority. "You are both in excellent health," he said, one hand on a chart. "Miss Bennett, your hormone levels are optimal. Mr. Blackwell, your analysis is exceptional. We have a very high chance of success with our first attempt." He paused, pushing his glasses up. "I am required to ask, have you considered natural conception?" Nora inhaled wrong and coughed. Julian went still beside her, like metal hardening. "Absolutely not," he said, and the room felt colder. "We will proceed with IVF." Later, standing in the parking garage, the air snapped cold around them. The door thunked shut behind them. A car alarm chirped across the concrete. "The embryo transfer will be in 2 weeks," Julian said, finally breaking the hum. "Until then, take care of yourself." "You too," she said automatically, and the words hung there, surprising both of them. It was maybe the first time anyone had said that to him without wanting something. That night, her phone lit up with a text not labeled logistics. "How is your mother?" She typed and deleted and typed again until the truth felt small enough to fit into a line. "Strong, like her daughter." His reply came 5 minutes later. "My daughter? Have you decided on the gender already?" And the first smile since the waiting room uncurled inside her, unexpected and living. 2 weeks later, Dr. Hartman looked down at a number on a screen the way sailors look at stars. "You're pregnant," he said, and for a second, Nora thought the word belonged to someone else. Her blood sang with numbers and newness. Her knees wobbled. Julian, who had insisted on being there without fanfare, went pale in a way that made him look more human. "Are you certain?" he asked, as if confirming a market analyst's report he already believed. "Absolutely," Dr. Hartman said. "We'll do the first ultrasound in 3 weeks to confirm the heartbeat. Here are your prenatal vitamins, Miss Bennett, and a list of restrictions." In the elevator, silence took up the whole car. Nora stared at the lit numbers, trying to get the world to shrink to them. "Are you okay?" Julian asked finally, voice tight. "I'm growing a human for a man I barely know," she snapped. The sarcasm thin armor that didn't cover much. "I'm just peachy." He hit the emergency stop. The elevator jolted, and the cables hummed, and everything got even smaller. "Look at me," he said, not as a command, but as something close. She did because he asked, and because her anger had flared and burned and left ash. "I am not a stranger," he said, intensity like heat coming off asphalt in August. "Not anymore. We are partners in this. I will be there every step of the way." "Why?" It came out harsher than she meant. "The contract doesn't To hell with the contract," he cut in. The force of it caught them both. He gestured toward her stomach, still flat under her sweater. "That is my child, and you are carrying him." "That matters." It was the most personal, unscripted thing he'd said since they met. Before she could figure out what to do with that, he released the button. The elevator jolted back to life. "I'll have Marissa clear my schedule," he said, the mask sliding back into place but not quite covering everything. "All prenatal appointments are a priority. I'll be at every single one." The first trimester treated Nora like a test. Morning sickness that didn't care what the clock said. Fatigue that came on like a blackout. The sudden violent hatred of coffee. The smell alone enough to send her into a fresh wave of nausea that would have been funny if it didn't feel like drowning. At 7 one morning, her doorbell rang, and there was Julian, impossibly out of place in jeans and a cashmere sweater, in her Lakeshore Drive doorway, holding a paper bag like an apology. "I read that ginger helps," he said, offering a bakery box full of ginger cookies, their sugar coats glittering. "You baked?" she asked, incredulous and amused through the haze. "No." Honesty again. Marissa researched recipes and a chef made them. But the idea was mine. It was so absurdly Julian that she laughed for real, the sound strange and bright. "Thank you." "May I come in?" he asked, lingering at the threshold, the way people do who understand the weight of entering someone's space. She hesitated and stepped aside. It was the first time he'd been there. He took it in like a curator, the photo strip of Nora and Mara in an old Art Institute photo booth, both sticking out their tongues, the pinned-up sketches along a corkboard, a charm bracelet on the counter, a worn quilt with patched stars over the back of the sofa. "It's cozy," he said, the word landing clumsy in his mouth. "You say that like it's a strange thing." "It is," he admitted. "My apartment looks like a hotel." "This looks like a home," he didn't say. And she heard it anyway, the absence speaking loudly. They fell into a rhythm that felt fragile and brave. He showed up with ridiculous snack combinations for cravings that made no sense: pickles and ice cream at 11 at night, a watermelon at 9 a.m. in January that had required bribing a grocer. He walked with her slowly through Grant Park when the wind wasn't cruel, stopping so she could catch her breath, and so he could say nothing and be there. They were building a friendship in the negative space of something else neither had allowed themselves to consider. Then she woke in the middle of the night to blood. It wasn't much, but panic isn't measured by volume. It's measured by what it means. Her heart went cold. Her fingers were clumsy on her phone. "I'm bleeding," she choked, and the word tore on its way out. "Julian, I think I'm losing the baby." "I'm on my way," he said, and his voice was an anchor thrown hard into a storm. "Don't move." He must have flown. 11 minutes later, he was at her door, and he didn't ask if he could carry her. He simply lifted her, like he'd done it before in another life, and put her in the back seat. The city streaked by, a blur of police lights and closed late-night diners and cab taillights. She squeezed his hand so hard he would later find half-moon marks on his skin. "What if," she started. "Don't," he said fiercely, knuckles white on the steering wheel, which told her how afraid he was for the first time. "It's going to be okay." It was a promise and a prayer and an order to the universe. The ultrasound room was dim and cold. The gel was shocking. The paper crinkled under her. She took his hand again because there was nothing else to do. The silence was a cliff. Dr. Hartman moved the transducer with infinite care. Then a sound filled the room, quick and whooshing, a tiny gallop. Her baby. Their baby, and the word she'd been avoiding bloomed in her chest. "And there we are," Dr. Hartman said, the kind of smile in his voice that people who love their work carry like a lantern. A strong, steady heartbeat, 145 beats per minute, absolutely perfect. Nora's relief broke out of her in a sound, half sob, half laugh. On the screen, a pulsing speck of light blinked at her from a galaxy of black and gray. Julian's fingers tightened around hers, and when he spoke, his voice was a version she'd never heard. "So small," he murmured, awe unwrapping everything hard in him. How is something that small so powerful? "About the size of a blueberry," Dr. Hartman said. "The bleeding is likely late implantation. We'll monitor you closely, but there's nothing to be alarmed about." Everything changed for Nora in that moment. This wasn't a clause or a check. It was a person. And it wasn't the baby. It was their baby. In the weeks after, Julian transformed in ways that would have been comedic if they hadn't been so unbearable sweet. He read every prenatal book he could find, highlighter marks filling margins he'd never thought he'd care about. He delivered a serpentine pregnancy pillow so long it looked like a tame white snake invading her bed. He arranged for a nutritionist to review Nora's meals, then texted pictures of the meals he was making for himself so she would see he was taking it as seriously. "Julian, you're going overboard," Nora said one afternoon, smiling around the warmth that this care had lit in her. "I am ensuring optimal conditions for the asset's development," he replied, tone formal, eyes saying something with far fewer syllables. Then he appeared with a book a week later, Baby Names from A to Z. He held it like a peace offering. "I thought, if you wanted, we could choose together," he said, the hesitance so unlike him it made her throat tight. "I thought you would decide," she said. "You have sole custody." "It's your child too, Nora," he said gently, "for the next 7 months and, in a way, forever. You deserve a voice." They sat on her sofa with a throw blanket over their knees, laughing at names that sounded like expensive candles and arguing good-naturedly about classics versus modern. The guarded billionaire melted into someone who teased and listened and asked why she loved the names she loved. "I always dreamed," Nora said softly, surprising herself with the boldness of it, of naming my daughter Mara, after my mother and my grandmother. She didn't add, after all the women who kept going. "Mara is beautiful," Julian said, and meant it. He was quiet a beat. "And if it's a boy?" "I've always loved the name Miles," she said. "Miles Blackwell." She paused, then tested. "Miles Julian Blackwell." He rolled the name like wine. "Miles Julian Blackwell," he repeated thoughtfully. "Mara Nora Blackwell," he tried, and then glanced at her. She smiled even as tears threatened. Hearing those names out loud felt like sketching the first line of a life. That night, she texted him at 3 a.m. about heartburn, because that was now a thing that happened. His reply arrived immediately. "Warm milk and sleep, propped up on pillows. It will pass." "You're still awake," she typed. "Always," came the reply. "Why?" she asked. "Because when I close my eyes, all I hear is that heartbeat. And it scares me how much it matters." They were far past the place any contract could define. They had drifted into a sea charted by fear and hope, and honesty neither had learned as children. The 12-week scan was supposed to be routine, a picture for the fridge, and a measurement that would get scribbled into a baby book that didn't exist yet. Nora had started to show, just enough of a curve to make her hand find it without thinking. True to his word, Julian was there, his focus relentless and soft at the same time. They had just started discussing the results with Dr. Hartman when the examination room door opened without a knock. An elegant woman swept in, early 60s, her Chanel suit the color of hard ice, diamonds as modest as a crown. "Julian, darling, I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd—" Her words froze as her gaze found Nora and then fell to the gentle rise of her stomach. The polite smile on her face cracked and fell away. "Who," she asked in a voice that could have frosted glass, "is this?" Julian went very still. "Mother," he said, chiseled calm. "I wasn't expecting you." "Clearly," Vivian Blackwell said, her gaze sliding back to Nora like a surgeon's scalpel. "Who is she, and why is she visibly pregnant?" The air in the room stopped moving. Dr. Hartman made a dignified exit without ever looking like he was escaping a grenade. Julian took a small step, placing himself between Vivian's old-world fury and Nora's quietly furious fear. "This is Nora Bennett," he said, voice colorless. "She is carrying my child under a contractual agreement." Vivian went pale, then flushed hard, anger blooming like fire under ice. "You hired a surrogate?" she hissed. "Without consulting me? Without regard for our family's lineage? For what this means?" "I don't need your permission to secure an heir," Julian shot back. A new kind of anger, a wounded one, vibrated under the surface. "An heir born of a business transaction?" Vivian's voice cracked sharp. "You have disgraced the Blackwell name." Their argument telescoped years into minutes. Words like legacy and bloodlines and the families you were supposed to consider shrapneled between them. Nora sat watching a history she hadn't asked to be part of unfold, a battle fought on a field that had just become her body. Every dart Vivian threw at her son found a mark, not because he flinched, but because Nora could feel the old bruises under his skin. "Enough," Nora said quietly, but the word carried. The two of them turned. She stood, one hand on the swell she felt both protective and proud of. "Mrs. Blackwell," she said, and her voice trembled in the exact way steel does when it's hot and being made. "I understand you're shocked. I do, but speaking about me as if I'm not in the room, speaking about your grandchild as if he or she were a bad stock trade, that's unacceptable." Vivian stared at her as if she'd been slapped. "You have no idea who you're talking to." "I know exactly who I'm talking to," Nora said, finding a strength in herself shaped like all the time she hadn't been heard. "A woman who has clearly never told her son that she loves him." The words hit their target. Vivian stumbled back as if the air had shoved her. Nora gentled her tone without losing any of its core. "Julian may have contracted my services, but this baby is not a transaction. This baby is a life. If you can't see that, then maybe he's right to keep you at a distance." She left before anyone could wrestle her back into apology. In the hall, she started to breathe again. Julian caught up, almost out of breath, a thing she wouldn't have believed he could be.
"Is she always like that?" Nora asked, half laugh, half despair. "Usually worse," he said,
a wry pain moving across his mouth that somehow made her want to touch his face. "Thank you for defending me."
"Someone had to."
After that, he disappeared. No texts, no ginger cookies, no late-night advice about heartburn. The silence grew a shape, a cold thing that climbed into bed with her and lay on her chest. She told herself it didn't matter. It was a contract. She lied. It mattered.
On the fourth night, he knocked. He looked like he hadn't slept, like worry had put ash on his cheekbones.
"Can I come in?" he asked, and the words were as raw as scraped knuckles. Inside, his composure cracked. "My father called," he said quietly. "He told me I'm dishonoring the family, that I should have made a suitable match." He lifted. Nora reached for him without thinking. Their fingers fit easy now. He looked down at their hands and then, very gently, put his other palm over her. "For the first time in my life," he said, voice rough. They stood in that suspended lift of, "At 24 weeks, your son is using my ribcage as a punching bag," she texted before she could think. "Can I feel?" came back immediately. She hesitated only as long as it took to type her address. He arrived quickly, nervous in a way she'd never seen, standing in her living room, awkwardly elegant. "So, where do I?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at her stomach, which made her laugh, warm and unselfconscious. She took his hand and placed it on the left side. They waited, breath held together. Then, thump. A solid kick connected with the center of his palm. Julian's face changed completely. Wonder moved through him like a tide. Everything guarded in him cracked open. "That was," he breathed, eyes wide. "That was your son saying hello," she finished, though she liked that he hadn't found an easy word. "Or daughter," he murmured, his mouth lifting. He left his hand there warm and protective as the baby kicked again and again. "They're strong," Nora said softly, "like their father." His eyes lifted to hers, and in them was a tenderness she could feel on her skin. "Or their mother," he whispered. He didn't go home that night. They watched a nature documentary no one remembered a minute of. Nora's head slipped into the soft place between his shoulder and his collarbone, and sleep found them both. He stayed very still, feeling the weight and warmth of her, the rise and fall of her breath, the shape of a future pressing against the lines of a past he'd been sure was his destiny. And then the truth hit him so cleanly it could only be called simple. "I'm in love with her." It was inconvenient. It was unfair. It was a complication he had avoided for years with the skill of a surgeon avoiding nerves, and it was absolutely unerasable. When Nora woke hours later, a blanket had been pulled over her. Julian stood in the kitchen, making tea, like a man learning a new language. "Sorry," she said, pushing hair from her face. "I literally fell asleep on you." "I didn't mind," he said, bringing her a mug and sitting. The sofa seemed to have shrunk by 2 sizes. "Nora, I need to ask you something." "Okay. After the baby is born," he said, and his careful voice betrayed him. "What are you going to do?" The question was a cliff. The future she had been avoiding was standing in her living room, asking for a cup of tea, too. "The contract says." "Forget the contract," he said, and intensity flared. "What do you want?" She looked at his eyes and saw that they weren't hiding anything. She knew what she wanted. This. All of it. The improvised family, the dog-eared schedules on the fridge, the little shoes lined up by the door, him. But the wanting was so big it scared her, and she had been poor for so long that wanting anything this much felt like hubris. I don't know," she said, untrue. Before he could press her, his phone burned through the moment with urgency. He answered and went gray. "When?" he said, and then, "I'm on my way." He looked up. "It's Mara," he said. "Nurse Patel called. There's a complication. We have to go." The ICU was all white and machines and time-hardening like sugar. Mara lay almost weightless under a hospital blanket. Words turned into clouds of breath. Sepsis. Organ failure. We've done all we can. Nora was a child again, small and furious with the universe, standing in sneakers at the edge of something she couldn't fix. Nurse Patel hugged her with an apology that was a world. "She's been asking for you," she whispered. Nora took her mother's hand. It was cold and familiar. "Mom," she breathed, "I'm here." Mara opened her eyes with the kind of effort that used to be reserved for moving furniture. "My girl," she whispered, almost soundless. "You're going to get better," Nora said. The lie was soft and shaped like hope. "Don't lie, honey," Mara murmured, using the name no one else got to use. She squeezed with unexpected strength. "You did more than any daughter should ever have to do. You gave me time." A smile, sweet and not from this world, touched her mouth. "Time to know I'm going to have a grandchild. I have no regrets." "You can't leave me," Nora sobbed. "I did all of this for you." "Promise me something," Mara rasped, her gaze dropping to the curve under Nora's sweater. "Love that baby. No matter what the contract says, love that child with everything you have." Her eyes turned to Julian in the doorway. "And him? He's a good man. I see the way he looks at you," she said, and her voice was faint but fierce. "Don't be afraid to be happy." "I can't do this alone," Nora whispered, her face wet, her heart splitting. "You're not alone," Julian said from the door, and his voice was steady and quiet in a way that meant more than loud promises. Mara's smile tilted toward him. "Take care of her," she said, and he answered, "I promise," with a weight that made a vow into a foundation. "I'm so tired," Mara whispered. "Then rest," Nora said through a river, kissing her mother's forehead. "I'll be right here." 3 hours later, with Nora holding one hand and Julian, because it felt right, holding the other, Mara Bennett exhaled one last time. Peace settled on her face like the touch of an invisible hand. Nora shattered. The sound she made was a kind of ripping, and she fell into Julian like the gravity that had been holding her upright had been turned off. He held her like a thing he would not let drop. His hand moved across her back in small circles until the shaking let her breathe again. The funeral was small, stitched together by people who mattered. Snow threatened and retreated. Nora stood by the graveside, 27 weeks pregnant, and so tired she felt transparent. Julian never left her side. When the last car had pulled away and the last bouquet had been propped in the cold ground, she said, "She was all I had. Now I'm completely alone." Julian turned her to face him, his hands careful on her shoulders like she was porcelain and steel both. "No," he said, sudden and fierce. He put his palms over her belly, a benediction. "You have him, or her." He lifted his eyes to hers, and the look there was so raw it made her feel seen down to bone. "And you have me." "The contract." "To hell with the contract, Nora," he said, and the passion in his voice startled birds. "Do you think I care about that paper anymore? Do you think this is still just business to me?" "Then what is it?" she asked, heart pounding in her throat, waiting for a word that would change everything. He was about to say it, about to throw his guard off a cliff, when she gasped in pain. She glanced down, a dark, wet stain spread on the black of her dress. "Julian," she whispered, terror boiling up wild and total. "Something's wrong." "The baby." He didn't hesitate. He lifted her into his arms, again, always. His own face a mask of fear that made him look 10 years younger, and every bit the boy who had wanted something and been told no. "Hospital," he said. The world became sirens in his veins, and red lights that always waited for him, and a car that leapt forward like it was his bloodstream. 27 weeks. It's too soon. The thought pounded through Nora with every breath. "Please, God, don't let me lose this baby too." The hospital blurred again, hushed conversations, beeping monitors. Dr. Hartman's calm stretched tight like cello wire. "Premature labor, likely triggered by extreme stress," he said. "We're going to try to stop it with medication, but at 28 weeks..." He didn't finish. The meds made Nora shake like she was freezing. Her heart stuttered like a bad drummer. The contractions paused and then came back, harder and closer. She clutched Julian's hand like she might drown otherwise. "I can't lose him," she cried, and the pronoun had never felt so heavy. "You won't," he said, teeth clenched, voice low and urgent like prayer. "I won't let you." He could no more hold back the ocean, but he meant it with a fervor that made the room shake. A nurse watched the monitor and bit her lip. The baby is in distress. His heartbeat drops with each contraction. Dr. Hartman made the call with the kind of sure that was earned the hard way. We can't wait. We're going to deliver now. Everything became a rush. Then a stop in a too-bright room. Doors swung. Fluorescent light pulsed. Nora watched Julian try to follow, and a nurse hold up a hand like a spell. "I need to be with her," he said, almost breaking, in a way no one would have believed if they'd only ever seen the covers of magazines. "I'm sorry, sir. It's an emergency cesarean. It's not possible." He stared at Nora across the space between them, and what she saw in his eyes told her the words even before his mouth formed them. "Come back to me, all of you." Then the doors closed. Syrupy anesthesia pulled at her. Pain became something that someone else would describe later. Hands worked. Voices threaded in and out like static. And then there was the heavy, terrifying emptiness of not pregnant, blooming too soon under the gauze. She surfaced to it like drowning in reverse. "My baby," she croaked, panic insisting on the only words. She tried to sit up, snared by lines and tape. "Where is my baby?" "Nora, hey, calm down. You're okay." Julian's face bent over hers, and it looked like he hadn't slept in days, and like he'd run a marathon in the parking lot. He was smiling, wetly, beautifully. "It's okay. They're okay." "They?" she whispered, the whole world tilting. "Twins," he said, breathless wonder lighting him from the inside. Dr. Hartman said the girl was tucked right behind the boy on every scan, a perfect shadow. 1 in a million. He swallowed and then said, "A boy and a girl. Miles and Mara." He had named their daughter after her mother while she was still somewhere under the ocean of anesthesia. The love in the gesture cracked something open in Nora that would never close again. "They're small," he said, fighting tears he let fall anyway. "But they're fighters." He wheeled her down the quiet hall to the NICU. The world a hush of beep and glow. The room was edged with light from machines that did what bodies weren't ready to do. There, in 2 clear plastic boxes, were the 2 smallest, fiercest people Nora had ever seen. Miles Julian Blackwell, 4 pounds, 2 ounces. Mara Grace Blackwell, Mara for Nora's mother. Grace for the middle name her grandmother had given every daughter. 3 pounds, 15 ounces. Fragile and wire-tangled and perfect. "Can I touch them?" she whispered to a nurse who had kindness pressed into the lines around her eyes. "Through the portals," the nurse said. A gentle touch is encouraged. Nora reached into Mara's incubator, her finger looking impossibly big. A hand the size of a grain of rice curled around hers with the invincible reflex that babies have been giving their parents since there were parents. The sob that tore out of Nora was love starting a fire in her chest. Beside her, Julian touched Miles's hand and made a sound she had never heard him make. "They're perfect," he said, voice breaking. "They're perfect. And they're ours." Days became an orbit between incubators and coffee cups that went cold, and cot beds where you learned to sleep in 20-minute bites. Miles grew faster, his oxygen needs easing first, his cheeks rounding, his tiny cry more indignant every day. Mara struggled, her lungs were stubborn, every breath a battle you had to cheer for. They lived inside the monitor's beeps, inside the nurse's soft encouragements. Inside the ritual of washing hands until they were raw. Inside the odd calm that came at 3 in the morning when the rest of the world wasn't expecting anything of you. One night, between the incubators, under the blue light that made everything unreal, Nora asked the question that had been knocking since the day her water broke. "What do we do now, Julian? About us?" He took her hand. His thumb made a slow path across her knuckles. "I tear up the contract," he said, low and sure. "We make this real. You, me, Miles, Mara. A real family." "What if it does?" he countered, turning to her fully. He gestured to the 2 small warriors fighting in their plastic wombs. "Look what we created because we chose to risk everything. So choose again. Choose me." She looked at him. Not the man from magazine covers, not the man from open-plan offices and charts. This one. The one who had held her together while she broke in hospital rooms. The one who touched his son's fingers and cried without shame. the one she wanted to be tired with for the rest of her life.
Yes, he leaned in and kissed her, and it was the kind that puts down roots.
At the door, a nurse smiled and didn't pretend she wasn't watching. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, not sorry at all. But Mara's breathing stabilized. She just turned a corner, the nurse winked. I think she felt that.
The next few weeks were a slow climb out of shadow. Mara's lungs learned the rhythm they were supposed to have. Miles decided swaddles were a joke and arms were better. Dr. Hartman walked in one snowy morning with the news that had decorated Nora's dreams for days. Miles and Mara can go home. Home. Not to a penthouse that looked like a hotel, or an apartment that was more view than life. A house in Ravenswood, with a porch and a maple tree out front, and a kitchen Nora had designed from a hospital bed between feedings, her pencil moving while monitors beeped, choosing tile and paint like prayer. On the day they were leaving the NICU, the twins small and perfect in their car seats, and the nurses doing the kind of smiling that held back tears, Julian pulled Nora into the hallway. "I have one more question," he said. And then he was on one knee in a hospital corridor that had seen everything. He opened a velvet box like a secret that had been waiting. "Marry me, Nora," he said, voice full and shaking for once. "Not because of a contract. Because I love you. Because I want to wake up next to you and to fight about whose turn it is, and to celebrate every ridiculous thing. Not for a season, but for always." She laughed and cried at once because that's what joy does when it's been hard-earned. "Yes," she said, 1,000 times yes. The first weeks at home were a glorious war. 2 premature babies meant feedings every 2 hours, tiny diapers that turned the trash into a mountain that grew back overnight, bottles that needed to be sterilized like a science experiment, and a kind of love fatigue that made Nora forget if she'd brushed her teeth and not care. At 3:37 in the morning, she'd be nursing Mara with the ferocity of a warrior the size of a kitten, while Julian gave Miles a bottle with hands that had signed billion-dollar deals and now fumbled for a burp cloth in the dark. They were ghosts in a moonlit nursery, bleary, happy, there. "Will we ever sleep again?" Nora moaned one night, her head bumping the back of the rocking chair. "When they go to college," Julian murmured, without missing a beat, and his sleep-drunk smile was her favorite thing now, a small sun in the dark. "Is it worth it?" she asked, in case the universe was listening. He looked from Miles's face to Nora's and back. "It's worth everything." They learned each other in the trenches. Julian, who had outsourced everything from laundry to pen refills, became a demon diaper changer and swaddle king. Nora, who had once considered a successful day one with beautiful renderings and a genius contractor meeting, now ranked hot coffee in the top 5 miracles. They took shifts. They caught each other's shoulders when one wobbled. They celebrated every victory like a parade. Miles's first real smile, that sudden gummy sunrise, Mara hitting a healthy weight, and the whole house clapping like a stadium. The first time both babies slept for 3 hours, and they considered framing the empty baby monitor screen. On a Sunday, Nurse Patel arrived with a casserole and a presence that smoothed out the air in the room. She cuddled Mara like she'd been born for this, and told Miles he was suspiciously handsome. She turned to Nora, eyes misty. "Mara would be so proud of you, honey," she said. "So proud of the mother you are." Nora ducked her head as tears rose. Postpartum hormones were a tide that didn't care about visitor hours. She would have loved them so much. "She knows," Julian said softly, and came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her middle, fitting his hands over her hips like they'd been made for it. "Wherever she is, she knows. And she's smiling." 3 months later, the doorbell rang, and all Nora's muscles remembered the clinic door opening. She opened the door, ready for a fight she didn't want. Vivian stood there, smaller somehow, her armor swapped for something like humility. "May I come in?" she asked. And the voice was quiet in a way that made Nora say yes against her reflex. In the living room, Vivian saw Miles asleep in his swing, and Mara being held by Julian, who going rigid when he saw his mother was a reflex. Vivian's hands fluttered, undecided between clutching her purse and reaching. "I came to apologize," she said. The words were hard for her mouth.
She looked from Nora to Julian to the babies and back. I was horrible. I was so obsessed with legacy and appearances that I forgot what a family is. They are my grandchildren. Her face cracked, the careful composure melting. I would like to know them. If you'll let me. Julian and Nora looked at each other. He squeezed her hand lightly. It was her call. "You can try," Nora said, and her voice was firm in a way that didn't require hard edges. "But if you ever hurt them, or him, you're out of our lives. No second chances." "I understand," Vivian said, and relief softened her shoulders. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It wasn't forgiveness that erases. It was the beginning of a road people walk on purpose or not at all. They married in the garden of their home on a spring afternoon that smelled like rain waking up. It was small, stitched with people who had been there when things were loud and when things were not. Dr. Hartman was there, smiling in a suit that was somehow both too formal and perfect. Nurse Patel cried openly. Vivian sat quietly in the back row, her hands folded in her lap around a silk handkerchief that had belonged to her mother. Miles and Mara were the guests of honor, asleep in a bassinet, dressed with flowers, their breathing the bass line. When they spoke their vows, there were no clauses, no totals, just the sharp beauty of promises said out loud. "You saved me when I was drowning," Nora said, voice shaking, because truth does that. "You gave me a family when I was sure the world had closed its doors to me. I promise to love you and to choose you every day, even when it's hard, especially then." "You taught me that love isn't a weakness," Julian said, and his eyes shone in a way that would have embarrassed the man he used to be. "It's the only strength that matters. You taught me that family isn't an obligation. It's a choice we make over and over with our actions. I now pronounce you husband and wife," the officiant said. And their kiss was the kind that sealed and opened all at once. The spell was broken immediately by two babies announcing their opinions. They laughed through tears and took care of what mattered most. The twins' first birthday was a beautiful mess. Blue and pink balloons bobbed like thought bubbles. The backyard filled with people who had become home. The golden retriever they couldn't resist adopting answered to Moose and shed like a second carpet. Miles, wobbly and determined, chased Moose across the grass, giggling the kind of giggle that minted new cells in their bodies. Mara, more observant and cautious, watched, then pulled herself up using the picnic blanket until she plopped back down and looked at Nora, who clapped like a fan and kissed her dark hair. "They're so different," a friend said, smiling. "Like us," Julian replied, sliding an arm around Nora and pressing a kiss to her temple. He lifted Mara, who burrowed into his shoulder like a cat finding warmth. Perfect in their own ways. Nora stepped back for a second in the quiet at the edge of the patio and let the scene settle into her bones. A year ago, she had been living in gray. Now color crowded everything, balloons and the green of the lawn and the bright faces of friends. She felt the hum of gratitude, the kind that doesn't ask for more because it already can't believe. "What are you thinking about?" Julian asked, joining her. Miles perched on his hip with a smear of chocolate icing like war paint. "How strange life is," she said, smiling. "How a cold, calculated business deal turned into the warmest, messiest, most beautiful family I could ever imagine." "Not so calculated," Julian said, keeping his voice low as if he were sharing something with the wind. "I researched interior designers, dozens. But when I saw your photo, read about your work, the way you talked about making spaces people could breathe in, I knew." He met her eyes. "It was always you, Nora. I chose you before we met. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you walked into my office and refused to be afraid." Later, after the last guest left, and the last balloon had lost a bit of lift, Nora found him in the nursery. He stood in the glow of the nightlight, centered between the cribs, watching them breathe like it was the only thing that made sense. "They've grown so much," he said softly. "Can you believe a year ago they were so small they could fit in the palm of my hand?" Nora slid her arms around him from behind and rested her cheek against his back. It's terrifying and beautiful all at once. They stood in that quiet for a long time, letting the rhythm of their children's breathing rewire something in them again. "Nora," he said at last, and there was a boyish nervousness in it that made her grin against his sweater. I want more." She pulled back slightly.
More what? More cake? More balloons? More of Moose eating paper plates? More kids, he said, turning to face her, a head-shaking, mischievous grin he'd keep for their private moments. With you. Not right away, God, no. We're exhausted, but eventually, I want this house to be louder. I want more chaos, more love.
You, Julian Blackwell, the man who didn't believe in love, wants 4 kids? She teased.
5, he corrected, eyes dancing. I was thinking 5.
You're insane, she laughed, and the happiness in it was a light that could be seen from the street. For you, he said, kissing her like the vows were happening all over again. For the first time since fluorescent hospital lights had made everything cruel and bright, Nora realized she wasn't surviving anymore. Hope had taken root. Loss had remade space. Hope had returned like sunrise. And now, with her family tucked into their small corner of the world, she could feel the tremor of a breakthrough that wasn't a moment, but a life. They had become a home.